Welcome. I'm Peter Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's father. We are here in Albemarle County in Virginia, just for an idea of what things were like back in the colonial days, prior to the American Revolution. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about young Tom, my son. At the moment, he's his mother's child, James, and although he looks like he might have my height when he grows up, at the moment he has the build of his mother, which makes him a little bit lanky, and I'm not sure he'll ever outgrow that. Intelligent boy. I spend my time wandering through the woods of the Virginia mountains, and young Tom, unfortunately, will be around 12 when I die, and to him I will always be larger than life, which is unfortunate because he has in his own time a larger than life experience. One of the things I never quite understood, though, was how he was able to become such a famous person with his voice. The boy had a voice that was like chalk scratching fingernails on a chalkboard. It was high, it was squeaky, and it was hard to accept. As a matter of fact, he was noted throughout his life for having very few words, and probably because where he got used to talking in front of people that knew him, every time he saw a stranger in the crowd, he would get nervous and shut up. And probably one of the reasons why he never did any campaigning when he was run for president. On the other hand, he was a man of my period too, which unfortunately included a lot of problems that would be seen differently in a later era. We had slaves. It was common in that period, and it was something that went back further than most people realize. Many of the early colonists that came over from England were indentured servants. Now, in truth, an indentured servant signs over their life for a period of time, 7 to 10 years. And during that 7 to 10 years, they are treated quite literally like slaves. The difference is, at the end of their indenture period, they have a right to go where they like and do what they like. Unlike slaves that were not only always slaves, but all their children were slaves. This became a big problem for Thomas, not so much with what I did and what he did, but his wife's father had over 100 slaves, and when he died, Thomas inherited his slaves. He treated them well. In fact, many of them he tried to give a trade. But once again, things have gotten very complicated, in what was known and understood in my era is less than understood in the future. And that is that slaves were not a singular group of people. We had field slaves, which were in fact Ashantis. They were people from South Africa, very black, very strong, very capable of working in the fields, and their cost was not overly expensive. But we also had house slaves. And if you read the books, there's two things you'll notice. House slaves were typically of lighter complexion, which is interesting. And house slaves were always acknowledged as African, not black, not anything that would be derogatory toward the black, but African. And one would wonder why that would be. Why would they always refer to the house slaves as Africans? The answer is, if you study the process of slavery as it was practiced in the 17th and 18th centuries, you'll realize that the people who were the slavers, trading in slaves, were usually Americans or colonialists, or English, French, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, the people from Northern Europe. What's important about that is because of the way the currents go, when you go from, the currents go north and east, and then the currents go south along Europe, and then across Gibraltar. They cross along the east coast, or the west coast of Africa, and at that point the currents turn toward the west, taking them to South America, and the currents now head back up north and into the Caribbean and to the southern states where slavery was most often practiced. Obviously, going from New England and Europe to South Africa to gather the Ashanti slaves, they had to carry something of value. And in addition to carrying something of value, they also had to sail past miles and miles of Barbary Coast pirate area. Now, Barbary Coast pirates were free to take slaves anywhere they wanted, and they frequently took slaves from Europe and North Africa in the Mediterranean. And if those people don't have family that can raise the ransom, they become slaves to the Barbary Coast pirates. So how do the slave ships pass the Barbary Coast pirates without losing everything they have? Well, what would keep the Barbary Coast pirates from attacking them? Perhaps if they were customers. So the slavers stop at some of the northernmost Barbary Coast ports, and they buy slaves. But these slaves would not be the South African slaves. They might still be considered African, because even if they were from Greece or Italy, they were in fact now slaves to the Barbary Coast pirates, which is North Africa. So that way they are given a flag system that they can fly from their masts, where other Barbary Coast pirates know that they are customers, clients, and to let them go, because they are definitely repeat business. They now have entertainment for their part of the voyage, continue down to the Congo and to the South African Ashantis, get the number of slaves they want, and then follow the currents back to the Americas, back to South America and the Caribbean, where the slaves are then sold. The Barbary Coast slaves, being light-skinned and more affable to the Europeans, to the minds of the Europeans, then become house slaves, and the Ashantis become field slaves. So what does this have to do with anything? The importance of it is in a slave that Thomas inherited from his wife's father, who's called Sally Hemings. A lot has been put up about Thomas and young Tom and Sally as having children, which is questionable, because Thomas, like most southern plantation owners, did not believe in mixing the races between the black and the white. They had no problems with the Native Americans and the first persons mixing with the white, but a little bit harder for them to accept the blacks and whites, because they felt the blacks were far inferior. So Sally Hemings was a slave. How did Thomas rectify in his own mind having children with his slave? Well, the first thing you need to know about is Sally Hemings was a third-generation slave. Her mother had been the slave of the father-in-law's slave of the father-in-law, and in fact Sally's father was the father-in-law of his wife, which means Sally was half-sister to Thomas Jefferson's wife, and quite likely looked a lot like her. Now, her father was, well, her grandmother, and her grandmother's name, Hemings, came from an English sea captain that had tried to buy her grandmother, but his father-in-law refused. And rather interesting story if you want to read it, but ultimately the father-in-law brought Sally and Sally's family to the Americas, and ultimately had Sally's mother, and then Sally. I'm not quite sure how all that worked, but in any case, the grandmother was in fact the one that got the Hemings name. The interesting thing about the grandmother is she was always referred to as an African, as I mentioned before, but if you look up her name is a Greek name. that suggests that she may well have been a Barbary Coast pirate slave that was captured on a vessel in the Mediterranean carrying Greeks, and when her family could not pay the ransom, the Barbary Coast pirates kept her, and she ended up on the Atlantic coast, where she was purchased by, I don't believe Hemmings bought her, but by another English captain who was heading down to the Congo and back to the Americas with slaves. What does that mean? That means Sally Hemings was not black. She was African, but she was white. And Thomas knew that, Sally knew that, and most of the other people around knew that. As a matter of fact, when Sally went to France to take care of Thomas's youngest daughter, she was 15 years old and she came back pregnant, but everybody said it was Thomas's child. But wouldn't one question the idea that he would be having sex with a person that was spending the daytime entertaining his daughter? Doesn't seem quite reasonable. So the next question is, that is the next question. Sally's term in France, as a matter of fact, her and her brother were with Jefferson, my son Thomas, in France. Everybody there thought they were indentured servants and were white. None of them suspected they were black at all. They did not look anything like a black Ashanti slave. So the idea that Jefferson was having sex and children with one of his slaves was something that caused him problems during his tenure as working with the presidency and ultimately being the president. But how do you think people would have taken to it if they'd have known he had white slaves? Interestingly enough, George Washington had a similar situation where he had a white house slave, or who was probably a white house slave just as Sally was, that was sister to his wife. I don't know that he had any children with her though. This is Peter Jefferson thanking you for joining me and hoping you will see me again.